Hi, I'm Debbie Harbeck, and I'm a certified life coach working with women in midlife and through the menopause transition. So each week, I'll be sharing the latest information, inspiration, and generate some momentum so you can move forward and feel more in control of your changing midlife body and your life. Let's go. Okay, so welcome to the Midlife Momentum podcast. And I'm here today. I've got a special guest with me. Her name is Gail Seemann, and she's a licensed professional counselor with over 22 years of experience working with patients of all ages who've been diagnosed with mild to severe levels of trauma and behavioral issues. And she's a mother also to a now young adult daughter who's been diagnosed with ADHD and autism. And Gail has a passion of working with others with similar diagnoses and their families. She's recently added coaching services to this end, helping her clients move forward in their lives beyond therapy. And Gail, I'm thrilled to have you on the podcast. Thank you for joining me today.
I'm excited to be here.
So I wanted to have you on the podcast because, and I know this is a podcast for women in midlife, but it's sometimes only in midlife that we even understand or know that we have a diagnosis of perhaps ADHD or autism or what you call being neurodivergent. So I'm wondering if you could explain those terms a little bit before we get into anything else. Can you do that for us?
Absolutely. So neurodivergence is this expanding term, but the way I use it is just to refer to primarily those diagnoses of ADHD and autism. So ADHD and autism have some similarities, but they are different neurologically. ADHD is seen as difficulty with focus, distractibility, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. And those three basic categories, but there's no particular difficulty with socialness, except if your inattentiveness kind of prevents you from noticing that people are interested in talking with you, or if your impulsivity has you interrupting a lot. Other than that, you pretty much have the social abilities of most everyone else. Whereas if you have autism, there's an extra dimension where that social reciprocity, the ability to go take turns in conversation or engage with someone with eye contact and the other social things that we learning socially is also difficult for folks with autism. So that's the extra bit that's added. Most folks with autism will have some ADHD symptoms. Sometimes they're not difficult enough to rise to diagnosis, but often they do. And there's a new term out there that I've just learned about. And while I was prepping for this podcast, I saw that there are people that call themselves AUDHD, AUDHD. And that's because it's common to have both of those together, and it presents some extra difficulties for a person beyond just one or the other of those diagnoses. Does that cover it?
Yeah, and the term neurodivergent. So what does that
Oh,
mean exactly, and is that all linked together?
so basically, that your neurology is not typical. With folks with ADHD, the prefrontal cortex isn't completely turned on, and that's why people will have those difficulties with attention on especially things that they don't really care about. But sometimes, even when they really do want to pay attention, they just cannot. And you'll have kids that are trying to do math problems that they've done studies and had them in functional MRIs watching that brain chemistry, and they'll see those chemical holes basically appearing in the prefrontal cortex the harder they try to do the math problem. So it is a lack of those biochemicals that's really at play for folks with ADHD. So it is a neurological difference in that they can't get that part of their brain functioning on their own. There are ways to use your body and, end up in very maybe physical types of occupations and that sort of thing that can help compensate for that. But the stimulant medications, if you're in school, that's pretty much what you're going to need in order to be able to sit still and pay attention when you'd really rather be outside playing. And then there's more neurological differences in folks with autism. They are still exploring exactly what those are, as far as I know. Some of the studies I've read, though, have talked about the myelin sheath. There's a fatty sheath on our nerves, and that myelin sheath isn't properly formed for folks with autism. I've also seen a study that talked about nerves in the brain kind of not ending up genetically where they're supposed to terminate in the brain. They just kind of keep on going. And so, obviously there's going to be impact from that. And I never saw any follow-up research to really talk about exactly how that would be. But in my working with folks with sensory sensitivities, it occurs to me that they may just have more nerve endings in whatever part of the brain those nerves ended up. So
Interesting.
there are actual neurological differences, and that's why it's neurodivergence. You're diverging from more typically functioning people. So the middle of your bell curve,
Hmm.
95% of people are here, and then you've got these tails.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's where that comes from.
Okay, interesting. And I mean, and obviously it doesn't mean that there's anything necessarily wrong with you. It just means you diverge from the average.
Exactly.
But there's still a point where there's a diagnosis made, and I know there's women out there who are probably wondering if they do have ADHD or maybe even some level of autism on the autism spectrum. Do you see that in your practice? Like women who, or even men for that matter, who figure out later in life that this has been an issue for them and they didn't know?
Yes, absolutely. And I've had people come to me for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because they've figured out that they probably have the diagnosis because their child was diagnosed, and they don't necessarily feel the need to go get formally diagnosed, but they want extra help in understanding what it means for them in their current life, but also maybe teasing apart trauma that may have happened to them because people were expecting them to behave as if they had, fully turned on prefrontal cortex when they were 8 years old, and it just wasn't. And they would get in a lot of trouble. And
Mm.
that wasn't necessarily appropriate, but no one actually understood that. So maybe talking through some of those issues is also important.
Yeah, because I would think like if you're in midlife now, that means maybe it's 30, 40 years ago that you would have maybe had this condition, but it wasn't being diagnosed. Was it a known condition back then? Like
Yes,
ADHD and
it
autism?
was.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
you had to have a much severer level for it to
Mm.
be recognized. A, B, it wasn't as widely known. So you would have had to have someone who really was on top of things to find a professional to help you. And if you were a woman, I mean, a female back then, oh, there was a very small chance you'd be picked up. And you'd
Oh,
have to be acting out a lot to be a girl identified as having autism 40 years ago.
really?
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. And why was that? Does it manifest
It's
differently in girls
it
or?
it does to some extent. So boys tend to be more aggressive with their hyperactivity than a girl might be. Also, they're more social than boys in terms of using maybe peers to help them out with something they may have missed in class. Somehow getting around those deficits is a little bit easier. And it presents a little bit differently from my perspective. I don't really see the huge difference. But the hyperactivity probably at those younger ages, it's more difficult to pick up on. Unfortunately, not in my daughter, or maybe fortunately, because she was diagnosed at 5. So,
Okay. Okay.
yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, she was young because
Yeah,
she was hyperactive because you noticed that? Okay.
yes. She was a busy, busy, busy person. So,
Okay, interesting. Okay. Well, it's interesting to know that it could have been missed. So women who are in midlife now might never have been diagnosed. It may never have shown up as anything.
yeah, and
So,
especially if they're inattentive type, because you can have the with or without the hyperactivity. If you were just a daydreamer, people may
mm,
never have ever thought there was anything going on with you.
it makes you think. It makes you think back to
Yep.
childhood, not even just to yourself, but to your classmates and that, because you said daydreaming, and I do remember a classmate of mine who was a real daydreamer, and you wonder, but we didn't even know of those conditions back then. So this is the very early 80s. But
Yes.
yeah, very different time. So if you found, like, if you're finding yourself now with a diagnosis of ADHD or on the autism spectrum, what would you do? How would you get treatment? What would that look like?
It would depend on what kind of treatment you feel like you might need. Okay. So if you are looking for relief from your inattentive symptoms or your, distractibility or your impulsivity as an adult. So, like maybe you are spending money in ways that you wish you really weren't, and you don't know why you do it, but it just happens. Those kinds of things, then you're probably going to want to go to a psychologist and get a formal assessment, which should include a look at your IQ and a look at a computer based test that can show you, compared to other people your age, how inattentive, how impulsive are you. And then taking those together, they would be able to give you a diagnosis. They might add in school achievement, depending on whether you're trying to do college or that kind of thing. And then you would take that to a medical doctor and they might prescribe you some stimulant medications. I don't know how it is in Canada, but here you really, as an adult, you need to have that formal diagnosis so you can hand it to the doctor, because they're not going to be willing to prescribe those medications without something that formally says, yes, you need this for ADHD, because they are abused medications. But if you're only looking to process stuff that happened to you as a kid, you might just need to go find a counselor to talk to about that. If you are really not interested in trying medicine because you just don't want to put it in your body, and you're
Hmm.
just looking for methods that you can, amplify the coping skills you probably already have because you've been dealing with this all your life, that would be coaching would be a good fit for that kind of thing, because you're just looking on figuring out, okay, what new things can I implement that will help me feel life is easier, more streamlined, etc. Does that
Yeah.
answer that question?
Yeah, no, it does. It does because it does, the treatment would vary depending on not only, I guess, the severity of your condition, but also just your own personal preferences. And I
Mm-hmm.
guess you could do a combination, obviously, of
You
all of it,
absolutely can.
right?
You could do it all, yes. And
Okay.
with autism, the formal diagnosis may not be as important for you, or it may be. It may be that you really want to know because it would help explain things to you and you would feel more comfortable having someone give you the formal diagnosis. And that again, that's going to be personal preference. If you're at university, which that might mean you're younger, but you might be going back to school, having that autism diagnosis can be helpful in terms of accessing any kind of disability support services. So that may be where it would be important to get it. Whereas if you're a mom, you're a housewife, you don't have the need to get a diagnosis, you don't have to have it unless it's something that would really help you psychologically deal with whether or not you've got it. Does that make sense? I have people that come in
Yeah.
and want both. I've got people that come in and say, I don't really need the diagnosis. I just want someone who understands this. And as we talk and I use some of the techniques I use with folks with autism, they're like, oh, yeah, this works. And it helps them understand maybe how to communicate about themselves to their spouse, to their extended family, to their friends. That's
Yeah, I can understand definitely that somebody would want to have a diagnosis, to put a name to it, because then they feel like, oh, I'm
this
seen
is a thing,
now. This
right?
is a thing. It's not just me. I can
Right.
see that side, but I can also see the other side where you don't want to be labeled. You don't want to
Exactly.
put a slap a label on yourself or have anybody else do that. So I can see both. I can see both sides of that.
Yep.
But definitely, either way, without a formal diagnosis, you could go talk to somebody like a counselor, as you said, or even like a coach.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, not all counselors have an understanding of working with folks with autism. So you
Hmm.
would want to look for someone that's advertising that as a specialty.
Yeah.
There are
Oh,
more and more and more people that do that now, but you do need to double check because there are folks that really just don't.
okay. Yeah, no, that would be important. No, thank you for that.
Yeah.
So, so if we're going in midlife and we're in this time of life where everything's changing, our hormones are changing, our body's changing, can that be a factor if you have ADHD or autism? How does that fit?
Absolutely, I think. So if we think of menopause and that part of our change of life as reverse adolescence, I think it becomes clear how it can be a factor. So emotional regulation in general is difficult for folks with ADHD because of that impulsivity, and for folks with autism because of perspective taking and impulsivity. And then you add on top of that hormones, they may be more likely to be snippy, even than someone who's more neurotypical, who's having their change of life. So relationships can be a little bit more fraught, and you can feel just out of sorts at a level that you haven't maybe since you were in adolescence. So it's making everything feel extra. And there's a lot of coping that you may have been doing if you haven't been identified and you don't know that this is your diagnosis. And you've been over functioning for decades at this point, especially if you've had children and maybe you've had a job and you've just been juggling all these balls because you really believed you just didn't have a choice, and you run into a wall because with the hormones it's just overwhelming. Your exhaustion just takes over and you crash, and that can be a time where you're seeking out help. I've had one client who approached me because she didn't realize it, but I believe, she didn't have any physical diagnoses. I mean, illness diagnoses like fibromyalgia or any of the other fatigue inducing type things. She just was in autism burnout. And
Okay.
autism burnout is, you hit that wall and you just don't feel like you can function.
Wow. So that I can see how it can be absolutely exhausting. It's already exhausting when you get to midlife and things are happening and maybe you're not sleeping as well and there's so many other factors. And then put that on top of it that you may have like you may have been coping for decades and all the energy that that's taken from you, but you've done it up until now, and then all of a sudden the wheels start to fall off because
Boom. Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, autism burnout. Interesting. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, it's a term. I don't know if it's, I don't know if the DSM-5 is considering it. That's our, manual of diagnoses, but I have seen it. I've seen it in my own daughter. It is a thing. If the entire world were quote unquote neurodivergent, neurodivergence wouldn't be a thing. So if the world
Hmm.
operated, with the sensory sensitivities included and with due dates being flexible and with all of the things, getting to work on time, if we didn't have any of that stuff, then you might not get exhausted.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
because you're trying to be social and you're trying to do it in the way that everybody around you expects you to do it, and you're trying to juggle all of these tasks because everybody else can do it, so why can't I? And I mean, it's just a lot.
Yeah. I can totally totally see that. That must be super super hard for somebody at this time of life to realize that that's what's been going on, but at the same time maybe like really realize, oh, but now I can get help and now is the time I can get help for it.
Although,
Yeah.
if you need to get through autism burnout, I mean, there's, levels obviously as there are with everything else, but sometimes you just need a complete break. I don't know that our medical system is up to figuring that part out yet. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
We're
I don't
still we're
know.
still on the bleeding edge with a lot of this stuff.
And I think that's an interesting point too, because a lot of women in menopause, even without this kind of diagnosis, are finding themselves where they need a break. Like they've been functioning at a certain level for years and now they're exhausted, but the system isn't built for that. So we can't just at 50 decide, well, I need to take a hiatus and then I'll come back
Right.
when I've gained my energy, or we have to do it as we're doing life. We have to figure this out. And it's really, that's even worse. That's
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
much worse. So yeah, I really hope that starts to be more and more recognized.
I'm
Um,
hoping so as well. Yeah.
yeah. So we're different. If we're neurodivergent, we are probably different than the typical. But how can we start to embrace that? So, we're not all the same, like it or not. Like there's no this is the perfect person and these are all the outliers.
No.
It's not like that at all. We're all different. So how can we even start to embrace, especially when we have that, if we have a condition like ADHD, like autism, how can we embrace that as part of who we are?
So Sometimes it's a struggle. I think the number one thing is to remember that we are all different, that we got the idea that we should all be the same, first from high school and then from our media. And none of that is true. And recognizing that there are things you are excellent at, no matter what diagnoses you may have. And there are things that you are bad at, and there are things that you are mediocre at. And you're just a collection of all of those things. And everyone around you is a collection of all those things. And we're just all riding along on the bus of life at the same level. We're just different. And if we can absorb that and really take that in and realize that there's no need for you to be the same as everyone else, it's not bad to be different. It's just different. It's only people that have an agenda that want your money, or have an agenda because they want to be the popular kids, or whatever, that makes difference, quote unquote, bad. It's not. It's
Yeah.
the nature of life. I mean, if you look at a leaf, they're all different. If you look at a snowflake, they're all different, obviously. If you look at a blade of grass, they're all different the way we are.
Yeah, it's so true. And I don't know why we are so stuck in this way of being, because it's a very competitive world. Like you were talking, going to school. It's competitive at school. It's competitive in the workplace. And it's not made to tolerate any sort of difference, really. You're trying to meet one goal, everybody, and it's a bit of a
Mhm.
race. Yeah.
And so the thing is that maybe that's just not the right place for you,
Mm,
right? Maybe that thing isn't your thing. That's
yeah.
okay. There's another thing out there that is, I promise you.
Yeah.
And you just need to allow yourself to find that thing. And it's true, society may not value that thing as they ought. That's not your problem. That's really society's problem.
No.
And until it's about putting bread on the table, in which case you may need to do something you're not that great at in order to make sure you can eat.
Yeah, and that's always the question. But what you said is so true. And even regardless of any diagnosis, that's where I found myself too. I was in a very accepted profession as an engineer. Everybody, oh, you're an engineer, and it's well regarded. You felt like, oh, it kind of made me feel good about myself, but I knew inside it wasn't who I was. It wasn't what I wanted. But that kept you going for a little while, right? But then it's
Right,
like, I have to face who I am, and this is not who I am. It comes with a lot of money. It's great, but at the same time, you're like, I need to figure this out for myself. Like you said, you need to stop and just figure out who you are, what you need to be happy, and what you need to thrive in this world. And it may be very different than what society is saying will make you happy and help you thrive, right?
right. Absolutely. I mean, it's so funny that you bring that up again, because that I have that background in computer science. I used to be a computer programmer. I totally understand exactly where you're coming from, because you were lauded for those abilities that you had,
Hmm.
that you still have. It's not like I can't do that stuff anymore, although I'm way out of date. But it's not me. And I think that at this point in our lives, it's important to focus on what is me, because we have the power now in our lives. A lot of times when you're younger, you don't. But when you get to this point of life, you have the power to be able to do that for yourself. I think it's an important thing to do.
Yeah, I think what you said there is so key. I think at this point where we're less concerned with what everybody else thinks, that's one of the great parts of being a little older, is you become a little less concerned, and you can feel free to explore more who you are and start believing that you can believe new things about yourself and about the world. And here's a perfect opportunity to do that. You don't have to keep going down the same path. Yeah, I love that. I love that. Which basically brings me to the question I ask everybody when they come on the podcast,
Mhm.
which is what is the best part of getting older for you? What has been the best part?
I'd say it's been perspective and freedom. So, essentially what we were just talking about, the perspective to realize it's not just about myself, but it's also about life. To recognize that there are ebbs and flows in life, and that's good and okay. And you're never, ever truly trapped because
Mm,
change is around the corner. I think when you're younger, it's really hard to believe that because your sense of time and just the amount of experience you've had. And so once you have that perspective, things that are difficult can feel not as difficult, not as risky, not as harsh because you can get through it. So that
mm,
perspective, I think, is really important. And then the freedom to take those risks.
mm, mm. Yeah, we need to give ourselves more permission to take those risks, I think, at this age. I mean, we want to do it, and I meet a lot of women who want to do it, but they still haven't given themselves permission to do it. So I think you've got to get to that freedom where you realize you do have that freedom. You've always
Exactly.
had it. It's like the ruby slippers. They've been there all along.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden now, yeah, you can actually use it. You can actually free yourself here.
And if you've been raising kids, they usually are in close to young adulthood by now. You have a little bit more freedom of time to
Mhm.
so that you can then turn around and focus on maybe yourself more than you have for, a couple decades.
Yeah, and you can be able to embrace the differences of who you are because then that's been something with me. No, I don't have a diagnosis, but I have a part of me which is like a little socially awkward, very introverted, these parts of myself that have been really hard to embrace for most of my life, that finally I'm giving myself permission to say it's okay. It's okay. And
Yeah,
actually, maybe those are the best parts of me.
exactly. Because where would we be without introverts?
Yes.
Some of the best thinking happens when you're introverted, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, so
So,
true. So
yeah.
true. Well, this has been super helpful and really, really interesting. So I'm really glad you were here today, Gail, because you answered a lot of my questions. And I know my audience, they probably have other questions too that we didn't get to here today. So I just want to know how they could possibly get in touch with you.
Okay. You can find me on the internet at lifestreamfamilycounseling.org. That's a nice long word. And there's a little button on there that lets you schedule a 15-minute phone consult. You don't have to be interested in seeing me to click that. If you just want to talk, that's fine. You can also find me on LinkedIn, and that's where I'm sort of more advertising my coaching side. And there's links in some of the articles I've written there to setting up a coaching 15-minute call, but it's really the same. Either way, you can just get in touch with me that way.
Okay, well, that is great. And all of that information I will put in the show notes. So, whatever platform you happen to be listening on, you can go to the show notes and you can get this information about Gail and some very easy links to click to get access to her quickly. So, I really, again, appreciate you being here today, Gail, and I really look forward to reconnecting with you, which I will be soon because we're already connected.
Yes, excellent. And it's been exciting and a joy to be here. So thanks for this opportunity.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Midlife Momentum Podcast. If you want to learn more about working with me, come visit me at debbieharbeckcoaching.com. That's Debbie, I-E, Harbeck with a C, coaching.com. See you next week.